TGIF. Thank goodness it's Friday. Hello, boys and girls. It's about 11:25 Friday morning, and I just Zoomed with a lot of, well, we didn't have that many from our class, but Lauren was there and Emma Ray from homeroom, and then we had some from Ms. Lampley's. We'd love for you to Zoom with us. So anyhow, I post it all the time on Dojo, so just keep watching for invitations. Okay, I'm going to quickly start reading. I hope you enjoyed Follow the Drinking Gourd, and I posted a Reading Rainbow about that, so please go back and watch that if you haven't. Today I'm going to read another story. This one's about the Civil War, and I hope you enjoy it because, part of the Civil War was about slavery. Not all of it, but some of the issues with slavery brought on the Civil War. Trying to get where you can see it. All right, so let's see. If You Lived at the Time of the Civil War is the title of this book. You can go and take AR test. Miss Carraway just told everybody on Zoom that if you listen to Where the Red Fern Grows, you can take a test and get 11 points on AR. Yeah, on Where the Red Fern Grows. Then yesterday, I'm sure Follow the Drinking Gourd is an AR, and you can get a few points for it. And now today, hopefully this one is. I'm not sure. But anyhow, here's some of the things we're going to be reading about. Introduction. When was the Civil War fought? This was after the Revolutionary War, of course, after we were a country, united as a country. How did the war start? Why did the southern states want to leave the Union? Which states left the Union? Which states stayed in the Union? Who fought in the Northern Army? Who fought in the Southern Army? What was the Union Army like? What was the Confederate Army like? Would you have seen a battle in the North? Or would you have seen a battle in the South? Did your home life in the North change because of the war? Or did your home life change in the South because of the war? Now, I hope I get to read the whole book. Oh, there's all kinds of questions. Whew, I'm not going to read all these questions. I thought that was all. Well, anyhow, just listen to the story, okay? If it gets too long, I might finish it on Monday. Introduction. Each day, decisions are made that touch you. Some you make, such as what you wear to school or eat for lunch. Some are made by others, such as when your mother makes a dentist appointment for you. You and your mother may not agree that you need to visit the dentist. What you believe is called your point of view. Having two different points of view does not mean that one person is all right and the other person all wrong, but deciding what point of view will be used is sometimes hard. Most problems can be solved by talking and each person giving in on some things. This is called a compromise. We talked about that during the year, too, when we were at school. All right, these two boys are tugging at a rope, each at opposition with one another. However, there are times in history when a compromise cannot easily be reached. People look at the same questions about life and their answers that are different. This book is about one of those times when different points of view led to war. It was a war that divided the nation. People had to decide whether to support the North or the South. The war has been called the Brothers' War because families fought on both sides. It also has been called the Children's Crusade because children as young as 9 years old were part of it. It touched the lives of all who lived through it, no matter what their age or where they lived. It changed life in the United States forever. It was known, and is still known, as the Civil War. If you look, this is one side. That's the Union, and this will be the other side, Confederate side. When was the Civil War fought? The American Civil War can be measured in 5 Aprils. It began in April 1861 and ended in April 1865 when General Robert E. Lee, who led the Southern troops, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, the commander of the Northern Army. How did the war start? Between November 1860 and March 1861, some of the states in the South decided that they didn't want to be part of the United States anymore. They wanted to be free to govern themselves. The newly elected president, and you'll know this name, Abraham Lincoln, did not believe the Southern states had the right to secede or leave the Union. But South Carolina withdrew and tried to take over Fort Sumter, a United States fort in the harbor of Charleston, so right below us in South Carolina. Since the fort was in the South, the Southerners felt it belonged to them, but the Union soldiers would not leave, so Southern troops fired cannons at the fort. It was April 12, 1861. After this attack, President Lincoln ordered Northern troops to prepare for war. Many Southern men left the Union Army to join the Southern Army, and the Civil War began. There's a picture of the fort that they were shooting cannons in Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, I've visited that before. Why did the Southern states want to leave the Union? Okay, can you make a prediction of one reason? Think about what we've talked about. Many families in the South lived on large farms called plantations, where they grew crops like cotton and rice. They needed a lot of people to work on the plantations. Ever since 1619, workers had been brought from Africa. Ships had gone across the ocean where black men, women, and children were taken against their will and sold as slaves when they arrived in America. Slaves had no rights, and they had to do what their owners told them to do. The South depended on slaves to work on their huge farms. Crops were the main business. By the 1800s, there were few slaves in the North. Many Northerners did not believe it was right to buy and sell human beings. And industry, not farming, was important. The South states were afraid that the government in Washington, D.C. would take away their right to own slaves to set up their own rules. They wanted them to be there to work their big plantations. All right, it's the next picture. Can't see it real good on my screen. The South did not like the name Civil War. To them, this meant that they had done something wrong by leaving the Union. They felt they had the right to leave and set up their own governments. Southerners used many names for the war instead of Civil War. The war between the states was heard most often. Which states left the Union? 11 states left the United States to form a confederacy, a group of states that works together but allows each state to keep its own laws. There are no laws that all the states must follow. South Carolina was the first, followed by Alabama, Florida, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. After the takeover of Fort Sumter, 4 more states, Arkansas, North Carolina, our state, Virginia, and Tennessee, joined the new nation. So they left the Union too and became part of the Confederacy. All together, they were called the Confederate States of America. There were 9 million people in these states, 3 million of them slaves. Which state stayed in the Union? Okay, here's a picture. Now, here's the legend that shows what it stands for. Red are the Union states. That means they stayed in the Union. And you notice all of them are mostly up north. And then you had some out here, remember, with westward expansion. We had a couple out west, Oregon and California. All right, then The blue states were the ones that left the Union, the Confederate states. And then we had the territories that weren't divided into states yet in the green. Okay? All right, so if you lived in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Delaware, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, or Kansas, you lived in a state that stayed in the Union. The border states of Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky also stayed in the Union, but many residents sided with the South. The western part of Virginia felt strong ties to the North, broke away, and became the state of West Virginia. California and Oregon remained loyal to the North. There were 22 people in these states, including a few slaves. There were many people who were new to America. They had left Europe to find a better life. Who fought in the Northern Army? Northern soldiers were U.S. citizens, men who came from other countries, and later in the war, free blacks. When the war began, the regular army had 16,000 men who had enlisted for 5 years. President Lincoln knew this wouldn't be enough, so he asked for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days. As the war continued, men stopped volunteering. The government started offering money to join the army. In 1863, the Union began drafting anyone between 20 and 45 years old. I think mostly men, it was all men, I believe. Most soldiers were between 16 and 30 years old. Many were unmarried because married men were often able to buy and substitute or pay a $300 fee so they didn't have to fight. How fair is that? Not at all. A private was paid $13 a month. Thousands of men from Germany, Ireland, and France, Spain, Great Britain, and Italy were in the Union Army and Navy. Who fought in the Southern Army? The South did not have an army or navy at the beginning of the war, only small state units. The president of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, because the South had their own president. His name was Jefferson Davis. Called for 100,000 volunteers, and many men responded. Few had any military training. Most had been farmers before the war. The South found it needed to draft men to fight in 1862. All men between 18 and 35 were ordered into the army for the length of the war, but owners of 20 or more slaves didn't have to fight. Substitutes were allowed until 1863. A private earned $11 a month, but men often went a year without getting paid. There were not as many soldiers for other countries in the Confederacy. Many of these were French, Native Americans, including Creeks, these are the tribes, Cherokees, and Seminoles, formed whole Southern regiments. In March 1865, the Confederacy passed a law allowing slaves in the army, but the war ended in April, so this never happened. What does the Union Army look like? What was the Union Army like? The troops of the North were called the Union, Federal, or Yankee, and mostly wore blue uniforms. So that right there was a Union soldier in there, right there. During the war, they usually named the battles they fought after streams, such as Antietam Creek and Stones River. They used maps in planning their movements, and rivers were easy landmarks to find. The Union armies were also named for rivers. The most famous was the Army of the Potomac. The Union flag was the Stars and Stripes. It had 34 stars that represented all the states in the United States before the war began. When the southern states decided to leave the Union, President Lincoln did not allow the stars for those states to be removed from the flag. A star for West Virginia was added when that state was admitted to the Union. What was the Confederate Army like? The troops of the South were called Confederate or Rebel, or mostly wore gray uniforms, although these were more butternut, a brown color due to the dyes used. They usually named their battles after cities such as Sharpsburg and Murfreesboro, because most battles took place in the South and the soldiers knew the land where the fighting was happening. Southern armies were generally named for states, such as the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. The first Confederate flag was called the Stars and Bars, but later became known as the Rebel flag. All right, and that's what the uniforms look like, and that's the flag, okay? So the reason, this is our regular American flag, but we only had 34 states then, okay? That's why there's 34 stars. And this is the Confederate flag. Would you have seen a battle in the North? If you stayed at home in the North, you probably wouldn't have seen a battle. Except for a few raids and some fighting in the western border states, Southern troops fought little on Northern lands. They felt it was their duty to defend their own land rather than attack the North. Two major battles of the war were fought in the northern states, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Remember Gettysburg, you'll hear that again. You may have seen a battle if you were a bugler in the Army, like 9-year-old Jimmy Dugan. His main job was to be the camp alarm clock, sounding calls for drills and meals. He also did other tasks like cutting hair and running errands. Johnny Clem was a 10-year-old drummer boy who became known as Johnny Shiloh during that battle. He was given the title of Lance Sergeant and went on to become a soldier, being hurt twice. Other boys were powder monkeys in the Navy. They had to get the gunpowder for the guns on the Union ships. About 20 boys under 18 won the Medal of Honor for their bravery. In the latter part of the war, some black troops were formed. The most famous was the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, but most blacks with the army were not soldiers. They helped the soldiers with daily chores and nursed the sick and those hurt in battle. Sometimes whole families, black and white, traveled with the soldiers. Now, those are the young boys they just talked about. This is rather long. Would you have seen a battle in the South? Since most of the war was fought in the South, chances are very good that you would have been close to a battle. Even if you didn't see fighting, moving troops and troops in camps would be common sights. Cannon fire was often heard hundreds of miles from battles. Smokes from firing guns and burning fields could get so thick it would block out the sun. Sometimes a home came under fire and the family left it or hid in the cellar. Your home may have been used as headquarters by the Army officers or as a hospital for the wounded. Male slaves may have been forced to help the soldiers stop Northern troops by digging pits and building dirt mounds for protection. Women slaves cooked and sewed for the soldiers. Children helped their parents. If a plantation became part of a battlefield, slaves took cover in the forest or ran away. While 18 was the enlistment age at the start of the war, some Southern boys couldn't wait. One story tells of a boy who felt it was wrong to lie about his age, so he wrote the number 18 on a piece of paper and put the paper in the sole of his shoe. This let him truthfully answer that he was over 18. Later, the Confederate government passed a law that let younger boys enlist. Boys as young as 11 joined. The cadets of the Virginia Military Institute, ages 14 to 18, helped win the Battle of New Market, Virginia. Southern soldiers came from families who had lived in the South for many years. Hold on just a minute. I'm fixing to look through some stuff. Okay, I'm going to read a couple more pages, and then next week, starting Monday, I'll read some more. Did your home life in the North change because of the war? The kind of life that you led before the war continued. People still farmed in the country. The cities there were a large number of factories and businesses. If your family owned a farm or business, it may have made more money by selling food, clothing, and weapons to the army. You would have lived in a big house and enjoyed parties and dances. You could buy fancy food and special clothes. Favorite children's clothes looked like army uniforms. 8-year-old Tad Lincoln had a small-size colonel's uniform, and other children had Zouave jackets, a colorful soldier's uniform. For many in the North, the push to supply the soldiers during the war helped them get rich. So that's the family and how they lived. Some of them lived in the North. Didn't affect them too much. But now it's different in the South because that's where all the battles were fought. But anyhow, if your family didn't have much money or work for someone else, the war did make your life hard. With higher prices for food and housing and often lower wages, everyone in the family had to work even harder to get money to live. Women took jobs when men left to fight. You always thought and worried about your family if they were in the army, but the fighting was going on far away. It did not make your life very different. All right, so that was the North. In the South, though, like I said, things changed. Did your home life in the South change because of war? Life was very different than before the war. Most of the battles were fought in the South. There were Union ships blockading the southern coastal towns. Every day, items could not be gotten. You had to make do with things that you had and used items in many different ways. So that's a Southern family. Cloth was made by spinning and knitting homespun wool. Neatly cut thorns became sewing pins. Dried persimmon seeds were made into buttons. Plants and vegetables were used for dyes. Onion skins made things a brownish-orange color, and carrot tops turned things greenish-yellow. Patchwork clothes and quilts were used in all houses. When the feet wore out on a pair of socks, the tops were carefully unwoven, the thread twisted on a spinning wheel, and then knitted into new stockings or gloves. Hats were made by weaving corn husk, palmetto leaves, and other grasses. With the men away at war, life changed. If you had chores before the war, you had more now. Even very young children had chores to do, from planting and weeding the garden to washing dishes. If you lived in a large plantation home, your life stayed almost the same, while the slaves stayed. House slaves helped with the cooking, cleaning, and washing. Field slaves planted a garden and tended the crops. But as the Union Army moved through the South, many slaves left with them or refused to work for the family anymore. For slaves, the war was an opportunity to escape to the North. Southern women and children had to provide for themselves, something they were not used to doing. All right, now we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up Monday with the other part. Have a good weekend.